Chinatown, the film, starring Jack Nicholson and Faye Dunaway, and directed by Roman Polanski, is widely considered to be one of Hollywood's masterpieces, and can be found on many top films of all time lists. While there are many things that make this film great, from the acting to the screenplay, I'm going to focus on its masterful use of tropes, particularly that of the femme fatale. Dunaway's Evelyn Mulwray stands as one of the most enduring examples of the femme fatale, thanks to the way she exploits and subverts a familiar trope. Her performance, and that of Polanski's nihilistic vision for Evelyn, keep the audience guessing until the finale's ugly reveal, and brings the femme fatale into modernity. In Chinatown, the femme fatale shades her sexist past and emerges as the victim of corrupt systems that she always has been. First, I want to give a brief overview of the femme fatale. Haley Sutton gives a comprehensive history of the genre in her article The Evolution of the Femme Fatale in Film Noir, but I'll do my best to summarize her work. Though the trope is best known in the context of film noir, it can be argued that it has existed since ancient times in the form of Calypso, the Sirens, and other powerful mythological women. But it seems the consensus is that the first femme fatale is the Bible's Eve. She is at the basis of many portrayals of the femme fatale, particularly Evelyn, who essentially shares a name with her and has a father named Cross. In the 40s and 50s, the heyday of film noir, the femme fatale was less a progressive representation and more a reflection of the male fantasy or fears at the time. While women flocked to the workforce during World War II, it was expected that they would return home when the men returned from war. When the men did return, however, they found more independent and strong-willed women, both a fantasy and a threat. Thus, the femme fatale, as she is recognized today, was born. While it is widely accepted that the 40s and 50s portrayals of the femme fatale were largely regressive by today's standards, they did offer actresses leading roles at the time that were interesting and fun to play, and the resurgence of the genre in the late 1900s provided a more nuanced look at the trope, with women who were fully fleshed out characters with motivations. Finally, I want to highlight one of Sutton's conclusions. She writes that the femme fatale exists for men and because of men. Most studies look at the femme fatale and that she was created by male anxiety about women becoming more independent, but this is just another way of placing her in the service of a man. Faye Dunaway's Evelyn Mulwray is perhaps one of the examples that gets closest to avoiding that. Though she meets a brutal end, it's less punishing a woman for transgressing the patriarchy's boundaries, although it certainly is that, and more of a commentary on film noir's habit of punishing a woman for transgressing the patriarchy's boundaries, and it's in line with the film's overarching message of hopelessness in the face of an all-powerful entity and a corrupt system. Polanski engages with the genre's original tropes masterfully, sometimes subverting and sometimes enhancing them to fit into Chinatown's depressive filmscape. Indeed, many things boil down to the fact that Chinatown is a film noir made after the genre's heyday. The resulting familiarity with the tropes is what allows Polanski to fruitfully engage them. We are first introduced to the real Evelyn during Geddes' retelling of a joke his barber told him. Unlike other femme fatales such as Giovanna from Obsessione or Cora from The Postman Always Rings Twice, Evelyn is not introduced in a sexual way via her legs. Actually, she's fully clothed. Her appearance feels powerful, particularly because of Jake's failure to notice her. Evelyn is immediately in control of the situation, grilling Geddes about whether he knows her before revealing anything about herself. When she does, it's clearly a bombshell to him, as he realizes the implications of the press he's just released. In a way, she is the detective in the scene, as she holds other cards and performs a miniature reveal all. When Geddes tries to regain control by telling her that there's no point in getting tough with me, she easily shuts him down with, "I don't get tough with anyone. My lawyer does." On introduction, we see that Evelyn is, like the other femme fatales, strong, assured, and willing to stand up for herself. She's introduced to us as the classic femme fatale, which is important to our perceptions of her going forward. When Jake meets Evelyn at her house, he initially refuses to speak with her, wanting to meet with her husband instead. Here, we see the patriarchy appear for the first time in relation to Evelyn. Again, like her contemporaries, she fights against it, not telling Geddes much about her husband's whereabouts. She fishes for more information. This establishes her as a fighter, both against Geddes and against the patriarchy. Furthermore, we see another commentary on women. As Danielle Barnes-Smith says in her article, Fatal Woman Revisited, the femme fatale trope was a way to pit women against women. The sexy, confident, alluring femme fatale was a threat to the good girl, the dutiful wife who abides by the rules. Geddes points out that the fake Evelyn, Ida Sessions, had it out for Evelyn's husband, but I think there was meant to be a conflict between the two women over the man. Interestingly, neither one really fits the jealous good girl trope, leading to a slightly more nuanced conflict. Additionally, Barnesmith points out that masculine bonds are portrayed to be stronger than feminine ones. Men are loyal to each other on a brotherhood level, while it is suggested that women are at each other's throats. Giddys feels this connection to Mulray, wanting to help him avoid the drama and the cheating scandal, where it is suggested that Evelyn feels no such kinship toward her fake self. Giddys meets Evelyn at a restaurant where he accuses her of withholding information. She's evasive, and because of the audience's familiarity with the femme fatale, we suspect that what she tells him about the affairs is also a lie. In her article, The Deconstruction of the Femme Fatale in Chinatown, Christina Garvin claims that filmmakers were trying to instill a sense of distrust in women's changing societal roles by portraying them as evil and without restraint. In the wake of World War II, where women were taking over men's roles and assumedly having affairs while their husbands were overseas, filmmakers tapped into the male anxiety of returning home to a changed society. Evelyn seems to be playing into that with her story about her affairs, but on another level, Polanski is also playing into that distrust. The audience knows to be suspicious of her because they are familiar with the femme fatale, and while Evelyn is lying, it isn't for the reasons that we think. On repeat viewing, this scene actually begins to show the cracks in Evelyn. She's only pretending to be the femme fatale. Her strong, self-assured facade is just an illusion to hide how scared and sad she really is. Garvin points out that her composure truly slips when she snaps, "Don't tell me how I feel." In reality, what she tells Giddys is only half a lie. Her name is Cross, but she wasn't having any affairs. Knowing how the film ends, it's almost painful to hear her tell him that it's hard for her to stay with one person for a long time because, as the audience, we know the reason. In this scene, Evelyn takes Giddys to her home after they escape the nursing home, and the seductive part of the femme fatale appears. Evelyn's given the staff the night off, alluding to what she may be hoping might happen. Still, when she hesitates to drink after Jake's toast, the possibility that she may have poisoned it surfaces before she, too, takes a sip. She points out that he isn't very good at his job, an emasculating comment that sounds right at home coming from a femme fatale. Polanski has situated Evelyn perfectly in a gray area where we are unsure of her motivations or alliances. Even her nervousness as she's cleaning Jake's cut is subject to suspicion. Is this another tactic to seduce him? Garvin acknowledges the effect previous femme fatales have had on the first impression of Evelyn, particularly Mary Astor's Bridget in The Maltese Falcon. Bridget acts as though she is scared and suffering, but is, in reality, cunning and manipulative. We expect another Bridget in Evelyn. We expect that her advances on Jake are calculated, that she might turn on him at any moment. And yet the kiss seems real, and as far as film noir romances go, this comes off as one of the more realistic and less abusive ones. And as we come to later realize, Evelyn's fragility is all too real. While Bridget exists in a time period where the femme fatale was only a threat, Evelyn exists under a director in a time that understood that women were not threats to men, but were rather being threatened. Bridget's frigidness and Evelyn's fragile fear are products of their societies. In the next scene, Jake follows Evelyn and finds her seemingly holding her husband's mistress hostage. When he confronts her in her car, she tearfully reveals that the two women are sisters. For the first time, Evelyn's facade begins to truly break down, and we hear real fear in her voice, although we, and Jake, still feel that she isn't telling the whole truth. Jake distances himself from patriarchal systems when he tells her that he isn't the police or the government, that he doesn't want to hurt her. Interestingly, Jake is one of the few film noir heroes who falls alongside the femme fatale, and I think what he says here is why. The femme fatale trope began in the 40s and 50s, and was not only a warning to women, but also to the men who might sympathize. It was a warning not to mess with the system. Jake sympathizes with Evelyn and sees that she is the victim, which means he's breaking the code, the bro code, if you will, which, as I said earlier, Garvin points out that the male relationships are shown to be more innate and loyal than women's. And this means he too must be punished. So the patriarchy targets not just women, but any threat to its power. And as we find out, Evelyn has been targeted all her life, so Jake's removing himself from that system is enough to get her to tell him a half-truth, one that is probably the closest thing to the truth she's told to anyone but Hollis. And we believe her when she says she would have done nothing to harm her husband. That, combined with her genuine disappointment when Jake doesn't return home with her, makes the audience begin to wonder whether our conceptions of her have been wrong. Having learned what he thinks is the truth from the cops, Jake storms over to Evelyn's house, where he calls them to the address and confronts her. He wants to know what happened before Escobar gets there because he wants to keep his license, and because he's once again been caught with his pants down. Jake's been lured back to the patriarchy side, and despite his telling her that he doesn't want to hurt her, slaps her several times. At this point, we have fully leaned into the trope of the rugged detective and the lying femme fatale, and we think we know what the rest of the film will look like. Then, Evelyn finally tells the truth about how her father raped her and got her pregnant, how Hollis saved her, how she wants to be with Catherine now, and Jake is reminisce. When faced with the patriarchy's crimes, he turns against it and aids Evelyn in escaping. We see now that Evelyn is no femme fatale, just a purposeful, both on her part and Polanski's, imitation. She is the victim, and has been all along. In some ways, this makes me wonder if the femme fatale has always been the victim, if not the individual characters, then the trope itself. Had this movie been made during the heyday of film noir, Evelyn would have looked very different, as the film would have catered to the male gaze. As it is, Polanski was able to give her a unique sense of agency and tragedy because of his own experiences. His wife, Sharon Tate, was murdered by the Manson family a few years prior to the making of Chinatown, so he was all too aware of the dangers that awaited women and that they were not threats to the patriarchy, but rather victims of it. He would also know that because he himself is a rapist who assaulted several young girls. Evelyn is a product of Polanski's dark world, victimized just like Tate by a man just like Polanski. We also learn about Evelyn's real motivations. Again, like her contemporaries, she wants freedom, although this time not from an abusive husband, but from an abusive father. This longing for freedom has always been how the femme fatale meets her end, because, inherently, freedom means breaking free of the patriarchy, and Evelyn is no exception. In a further commentary on the heyday of film noir, and in line with his nihilism, Polanski punishes Evelyn for her flight to freedom. In light of his crimes, many of Chinatown's scenes take on a new, disconcerting light. No longer does it feel like a condemnation of Cross, it feels almost like admiration. As Evelyn tries to escape with Catherine, the police, Cross, and Jake are all there. Evelyn shoots her father before trying to drive away, and a police officer shoots her in the head. The screaming Catherine is taken away to an uncertain fate by Cross, while Jake is ushered away in shock. We see the fate of the femme fatale play out as it always has, and yet, this time it feels wrong, even disturbing. We see the system's triumph, and even if we don't have the language for why it feels wrong, we feel that it is wrong. As Garvin says, we are forced to realize that there is no justice in a world where the patriarchy is in control. Particularly disturbing is the ambiguity of what happens to Catherine, although it's almost certain that she will suffer the same fate as her mother. Garvin also mentions the absence of a good girl in the film, and I wonder now if it is because Catherine would have grown into that role. At least, that's what Evelyn was hoping for her. But, true to Polanski's nihilistic vision, the good girl is defiled before she can ever become good. I think Polanski offers another criticism of the Hays Code here as well. Though Chinatown is not bound by these codes, I think it certainly plays off them in some ways, given that, according to Haley Sutton, the code demanded that the moral universe be restored at the end of films, thereby meaning the initial necessity of the femme fatale's death in order to achieve that order. Evelyn's eventual fate could be a criticism of what the patriarchy considered orderly. A victimized woman murdered, an indifferent and complicit police force, a rapist taking another young girl in plain sight. But all of it is okay because the masculine-coded men come out on top. I want to conclude with one last point. The femme fatale trope, in leaving behind the sexism-charged undertones, takes on a racial component in Chinatown. In his article, The Chinatown Syndrome, Philip Novak points out that Evelyn is often associated with Chinatown, both through Jake's analogies and through physical framing. Evelyn usually shares the frame with one of her Chinese servants, effectively surrounded by ghost-like Asian presences. In line with this observation, Barnesmith considers that the femme fatale acts as a stand-in for marginalized communities. If Polanski's framing was thematically intriguing, I find Barnesmith's statement a bit problematic, even if on the surface level it is true. These women often are stand-ins for the powerless and marginalized, especially with Evelyn's proximity to Asianness, as Novak points out. But I want to point out that it would not be accessible to the marginalized communities themselves to see these portrayals. Perhaps we can understand what Evelyn is supposed to represent and understand her plight on a surface level, but using our image in service of white women isn't exactly a great step forward, and it should be noted that our struggles, while both against the white patriarchy, are different and cannot be equated with one another. Novak also points out that, first, Polanski's portrayal of Chinatown reeks of Orientalism, or the fetishization of supposedly mythic Eastern cultures by the West. Second, he points out that we see Chinatown through Jake's point of view. To him, Chinatown itself is a faded, ambiguous, and dangerous figure. In the same way, Evelyn is doomed to tragedy, ambiguous to him and dangerous to him, given she rouses anti-patriarchal sentiments. In this connection, Novak points out that the femme fatale and Chinatown are inextricably linked. The inscrutable Asian culture that is a mere concept to the West, and Jake and the mysterious woman whose motivations are just as unfathomable as the East. This falls in line with Barnes-Smith's claim that the femme fatale stands in for other marginalized communities, but it also demonstrates the claim's flaws. Chinatown is meant to represent lawlessness, a metaphor for the pointlessness of human endeavor, while Evelyn is supposed to be a sympathetic victim. But you can't have these representations while also connecting them because the inherent disdain for Chinatown seeps onto Evelyn because of her association with it. Jake sees Chinatown as a metaphor for the lawlessness the system creates. If Evelyn is supposed to be a commentary on how women are victims of the system, you can't equate her to a metaphor about the system. Doing so may add more layers to the story, but it also detracts from the feeling of injustice Evelyn's death is supposed to invoke. In this way, Polanski mars his portrayal of Evelyn as victim through his metaphorical judgments of Chinatown. If the femme fatale sheds her sexist past, she dons the new age's issues, particularly that of race. And she will continue to change and evolve, Haley Sutton noting her recent jumping of genre into 2019's horror darling Midsummer, as well as the racy hustlers of the same year. Where film will take her and how history will see her can only be told with time.